What if I told you that the oldest ham in the world is sitting in a museum in Virginia right now? Under glass, 122 years old, still technically edible, insured by Lloyd's of London, and named after the man who forgot it in his attic. That an African-American cook named Jimmy Matthews made a stew from squirrels on a Virginia riverbank in 1828, and that people are still arguing about it today? That a Virginia peanut farmer helped invent commercial peanut butter, and that Virginia peanuts are considered so distinctive that they're the only American food crop with their own trademarked geographic identity? Virginia, the Commonwealth, the oldest continuously governed English-speaking settlement in the Western Hemisphere. 400 years of food history in a single state. In 1779, a sea captain from Bermuda named Mallory Todd shipped a quantity of salt-cured hams from his smokehouse in Smithfield, Virginia, to customers on the Caribbean island of St. Eustatius. In return, he received, among other items, a 2-pound cannon and a hat. That invoice is the oldest documented commercial sale of what we now call Smithfield ham. The curing method Todd used was learned from indigenous people who had been preserving meat with salt, smoke, and air drying in the Virginia tidewater for centuries before European contact. He combined their techniques with European dry curing traditions and the local climate. The tidewater's warm, humid summers and cold winters create a natural aging environment that cheesemakers and ham curers call a terroir, a place-specific quality that cannot be replicated elsewhere. Smithfield ham must, by Virginia state law, be produced entirely within the corporate limits of the town of Smithfield. The 1926 statute is explicit. The salting, processing, smoking, curing, and aging, all of it, must occur inside Smithfield's town limits. The minimum aging period is 6 months. Most serious producers age for a year, some for 2. The result is a ham that is dense, deeply salty, intensely flavored, sliced paper-thin, and served without cooking. More like prosciutto di Parma than anything you'd find at an American Easter table. Queen Victoria had a standing order for 6 Smithfield hams per week. The ham industry grew so large that Smithfield had to expand its town boundaries twice to encompass new curing facilities. P.D. Gwaltney Jr., one of the great ham men of the 19th century, began aging a ham in 1902 and forgot about it. When it was rediscovered, it was still technically edible. He insured it with Lloyd's of London. It now sits in the Isle of Wight County Museum in Smithfield, 122 years old, under a glass case, on a live stream camera called the Ham Cam. Virginia and Georgia have been fighting about this since 1898. Virginia is correct. Here is the evidence. In 1828, Dr. Creed Haskins, a Virginia state legislator, took a hunting party to the banks of the Nottoway River in Brunswick County. While the wealthy hunters were in the field, his camp cook, an enslaved man named Jimmy Matthews, went squirrel hunting and made what he had: squirrels, stale bread, onions, butter. He threw it in a pot over a slow fire. When the hunters returned cold and hungry, they were reluctant. Then they tried it. Then they asked for seconds and thirds. The Virginia General Assembly officially recognized Brunswick County, Virginia, as the birthplace of Brunswick stew in 1988. Georgia's competing claim rests on a plaque near an iron pot in Brunswick, Georgia, claiming the first stew was made there in 1898, 70 years after Jimmy Matthews made his on the Nottoway River. Georgia's earliest newspaper reference to Brunswick stew calls it an Old Virginia stew. The stew evolved over time. Squirrel gave way to chicken and pork, stale bread gave way to tomatoes, corn, butter beans, and potatoes. But the soul of it is the same: a thick, slow-cooked pot of whatever you have, made for a crowd, served from an iron cauldron that requires a day's work to cook correctly. The stew is still made in Brunswick County by people who call themselves stew masters. The paddle must stand up in the pot before it is done. When it does, it is ready. There are peanuts. And then there are Virginia peanuts. Virginia peanuts are the largest peanut variety in the world. They are grown in the sandy, well-drained soils of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, the same tidewater region where Smithfield hams are cured. They are distinguished from other peanut varieties by their size, their crunch, their clean, direct flavor, and the fact that their skins release cleanly when roasted. They are the peanut used in gourmet peanut butter, in high-end nut mixes, at ballparks, in candy bars where the peanut is the point. They are the peanut implanters and the reason Mr. Peanut was born in Virginia. Peanuts arrived in Virginia through the slave trade. West African people had cultivated peanuts for centuries, and enslaved people brought cultivation knowledge with them to the Virginia Tidewater. After the Civil War, peanuts became a major commercial crop, partly because P.T. Barnum started selling them at circus shows across the country, and partly because the Smithfield hog farmers discovered that pigs fed on surplus peanuts produced unusually flavorful, richly fatted meat. The peanut and the ham industry in Virginia grew up together. Amadeo Obici arrived in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania from Italy in 1896 and eventually made his way to Suffolk, Virginia, the center of the Virginia peanut trade, where he founded Planters Peanuts in 1912. Suffolk became the peanut capital of the world. Thomas Jefferson was wrong about Virginia wine. He was also right, just 200 years too early. Jefferson believed Virginia had the perfect terroir for wine grapes. He spent decades at Monticello trying to grow European vinifera varieties on the slopes of his estate, experimenting with Piedmont wine traditions he had observed during his years in France as American minister. He failed every time. Phylloxera, black rot, and Pierce's disease destroyed every vineyard he planted. He died convinced that America would someday produce great wine, but frustrated that he could never prove it himself. Today, Virginia has over 300 wineries. The Shenandoah Valley and the Blue Ridge foothills produce Viognier, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Petit Verdot in conditions that have attracted serious winemakers from France, California, and Australia. Barbersville Vineyards, planted on the ruins of a governor's mansion designed by Jefferson himself, won Wine Spectator's Best American Wine Award. The Jefferson Vineyards sit directly adjacent to Monticello, on the land where Jefferson tried and failed to grow grapes. Most biscuits are made by handling the dough as little as possible. The less you work it, the more tender the result. Virginia beaten biscuits work on the opposite principle entirely. A beaten biscuit is made by beating the dough, with a mallet, a rolling pin, a heavy iron weight, a special biscuit break, for up to 30 minutes, until it blisters and becomes smooth and tight. The beating develops the gluten rather than keeping it minimal. The result is a dense, cracker-like biscuit that is hard on the outside, slightly chewy within, and keeps for weeks without going stale. They are traditionally served with thin slices of Smithfield ham tucked inside. Beaten biscuits are labor-intensive in a way that suggests their origin clearly. They were made by enslaved cooks in the plantation kitchens of Virginia and Maryland, where the physical work of beating was not a burden borne by the person who ate the biscuit. Mrs. Hill's New Cookbook, 1867, one of the first comprehensive Southern cookbooks, specifies 300 beats for a family biscuit and 500 for a party biscuit. The difference in 200 beats was the difference between a good biscuit and an excellent one. Today, beaten biscuits are rare. The biscuit break, a hand-cranked machine that folds and flattens the dough repeatedly, still exists at antique shops and a few traditional kitchens. A handful of bakers in Virginia and Maryland still make them. The Rappahannock River empties into the Chesapeake Bay in the northern neck of Virginia, in waters that have been producing oysters for thousands of years, longer than Virginia has been a state. The Chesapeake Bay was once the most productive oyster estuary in the world. Oyster reefs rose from the bay floor and drove the entire ecosystem, filtering the water, providing habitat, feeding the food chain. Indigenous people had been harvesting oysters from the Rappahannock for at least 10,000 years before the English arrived at Jamestown in 1607. The English found the oysters immediately. John Smith wrote that the bay's oysters were large enough to cut into multiple pieces, and that the native people roasted them over open fires on the shore. By the late 19th century, the Chesapeake oyster industry was the largest in the world. Oystermen from Maryland and Virginia shipped oysters by rail to Chicago, St. Louis, and beyond. The harvest was so large and so fast that by the early 20th century, the oyster population had collapsed. The great reefs were gone. The oystermen were fishing a memory. The revival came slowly. Ryan and Travis Croxton, great-grandsons of a Rappahannock oysterman, started Rappahannock Oyster Company in 2001 in Topping, Virginia, buying back their great-grandfather's oyster lease, which had been abandoned for decades. They built a farming operation in the mesohaline waters where the Rappahannock meets the bay. The Shenandoah Valley is one of the most significant apple-growing regions in the United States. The combination of limestone-rich soil, abundant rainfall, and temperature swings between warm days and cold nights produces apples with the sugar content, acidity, and flavor that cider makers need. Orchards have operated in the valley since the 18th century. Some of the apple varieties grown there today, Albemarle Pippin, Newtown Pippin, Virginia Beauty, are pre-revolutionary cultivars that have been growing in Virginia soil for 300 years. Hard cider was the dominant daily beverage of colonial Virginia. Water from wells and rivers was unreliable. Beer required grain. But apple trees grew everywhere, required minimal care, and produced fruit that could be pressed, fermented, and consumed safely. Every Virginia farmstead had an orchard. George Washington maintained orchards at Mount Vernon, Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. The cider produced was not the sweet, pasteurized product sold in grocery stores today. It was a dry, tart, complex fermented beverage that a modern craft cider drinker would immediately recognize and respect. The craft hard cider movement in Virginia has revived these traditions. Potter's Craft Cider in Free Union uses heirloom apple varieties. Albemarle Cider Works in North Garden presses only Virginia-grown apples. Blue Toad, hard cider in Rochester. Skilled roots in the Shenandoah Valley. There is a soup in Virginia that appears on no menus outside the American South, and that has been served at the Homestead Resort in Hot Springs and at the colonial Williamsburg taverns for over a century without changing. Virginia peanut soup is exactly what it sounds like. Roasted Virginia peanuts, ground to a paste, enriched with chicken stock, cream, onion, and celery, seasoned and strained into a smooth, rich, golden bisque. It is served hot, garnished with chopped peanuts and a pat of butter. It is deeply savory, intensely nutty, and unlike any other soup in American cuisine. The soup has West African origins, as does the Virginia peanut crop itself. Peanut-based soups and stews are central to West African cooking, groundnut soup, groundnut stew, and enslaved cooks in Virginia's plantation kitchens adapted those traditions to the local crop, producing something that eventually made its way onto the menus of the great Virginia resort hotels and colonial tavern recreations where it has been served to tourists ever since. The Raleigh Tavern in colonial Williamsburg has served peanut soup since the recreation opened in the 1930s. Chess pie has no agreed origin. Nobody knows why it is called chess pie. The most popular theory is that someone asked what it was, and the baker said, "It's Jess pie," in a southern accent, and the name stuck. This is almost certainly not true, and yet it is the only story anyone has. What is true? Chess pie, a custard pie made from butter, sugar, eggs, and a small amount of flour or cornmeal to firm the filling, is one of the oldest pies in the American South, and Virginia claims it as its own. The Virginia version typically adds a small amount of vinegar or lemon juice to cut the sweetness, resulting in a filling that is rich and silky on the tongue but not cloying. Chess pie requires almost nothing. Butter, sugar, eggs. Pie shell. Oven. It is the pie you make when you have limited ingredients and unlimited technique. It appears in every Virginia church cookbook going back to the 19th century. It is on the dessert menu at the Inn at Little Washington, at every diner in the Shenandoah Valley, at every church supper in the Commonwealth. It has never needed elaboration. The simplicity is the point. 400 years of food history. One Commonwealth that still does not fully know how much it invented. The ham that Virginia state law protects within one small town's borders has been served to British queens and American presidents and is aging in a museum under a live stream camera because the man who owned it forgot it in his attic and it refused to go bad. The stew that an enslaved man made from squirrels on a Virginia riverbank in 1828 is still being made in iron cauldrons by people who take stew mastery seriously. The peanut that West African enslaved people cultivated in the Virginia soil became the global standard for gourmet nuts and put a cartoon aristocrat in a top hat on snack bags across the world. Thomas Jefferson planted grapes on a hillside at Monticello and failed every time, and died believing Virginia would make great wine someday. He was right, and the vineyards are on that same hillside now, and you can visit them and taste what he spent his life imagining. Not every state has a ham protected by state law and aged in a museum. Not every state's most famous stew was invented by an enslaved cook, whose name was lost for a century and is only now being properly remembered.